Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's time for another worst to best ranking. Alright, we finally made it to the end of my 10th anniversary celebration plans. And of course, I've saved the biggest and most important video for last. I don't think I need to explain why this video is the most important. There is frankly a 0% chance that you watch my videos and don't already know who Aphex Twin or Boards of Canada are. If anything, I'm sure people will be more curious as to how a video like this hasn't already existed on my channel years earlier. I mean, if one is to look at the videos on my channel in order of most popular, you'll notice that almost every other video, especially if you look at the individual album reviews, are just about Aphex Twin or Boards of Canada. You'll get your smatterings of Oudiker and Daft Punk and Deadmau5 and Kraftwerk and Orbital, but nothing has ever gotten sheer consistent numbers for me like the old discography reviews I did on Aphex Twin and Boards of Canada way back in 2016 and 2017 respectively. There's like a noticeable disparity between my coverage of those two acts in particular and everything else I've made on this channel. And I wouldn't be surprised if a bunch of people clicking on this video didn't even realize that I've been regularly uploading on this channel for 10 straight years, and I didn't just stop after there wasn't any more Aphex Twin or Boards of Canada to talk about. There's so many people out there who consider these two acts the only names in electronic music that really matter and will never be interested in hearing about anyone else in the genre. Their loss. Now, the idea of doing album rankings for either of these artists feels like it would be the easiest no-brainer. I mean, that was a format I didn't start to regularly do until around late 2018, early 2019, after I'd started to actually get good at this whole review writing thing. And of course, immediately when I first started doing album rankings, I got requests pouring in to do album rankings for Aphex Twin and Boards of Canada. But I never did. In fact, I actively turned the requests down since I didn't think there would be an interesting enough discussion for me to provide. Boards of Canada only have 4 studio albums, and I felt like there wasn't enough of substance I could say in a ranking that wasn't just word for word restating what my old review said. And Aphex Twin, well, he has 6 albums and change, technically a bit more to talk about by quantity. Although back in the days people were most frequently asking me to make that video, I felt like other people beat me to it and did it in a better and more interesting way than I would have been able to back then. For instance, there was a channel called The Sound Binge that did really good rankings of both artists at the time. She's not actively uploading anymore, but those videos are still up and still worth watching. I also thought Liam the Music Reviewer did a really good Aphex Twin ranking a few years later as well, and one that even has Oliver from Deep Cuts reading some quotes on it as a bonus. I mean, how am I gonna top that? What more do I have to add to these conversations? So I just never went through with making individual rankings for these artists. But now it's 2025. I've been doing this for 10 years, and my old videos on these two acts are really showing their age more and more. For the record, I personally find any videos I made on this channel before 2018 to be borderline unwatchable, since I hadn't yet gotten the hang of writing and structuring reviews yet, or even really delivering to camera yet in some cases. My review of Selected Ambient Works 8592 is one of the very first videos I ever uploaded on this channel all the way back in 2015, and I look and sound and write like absolute crap. I'm like leaning back in the video like this and talking kind of like this. We wouldn't have all these other ideas. We wouldn't have It's not good. So when I was thinking about how I wanted to celebrate the 10th anniversary of this channel, the thought randomly popped into my head. What if I knock both of these birds out with one stone and just rank all of their albums together in the same video? There could be an actual interesting conversation there, especially now that there's an added value of me getting to provide updated takes on these artists that aren't horribly out of date, or delivered by the way more awkward early 20s version of me. Now, some people might look at that and say, wait a minute, but these two artists don't have anything to do with each other. Sure, they, along with Oudiker, are the most popular names on Warp Records, and are both credited with popularizing the IDM genre around the same time, and as such have a Venn diagram of fanbases that's close to just being a circle. But it's not like Richard E. James and Mike and Marcus Sanderson are literally the same people. These are two completely separate acts with two very different styles that are not easily comparable to one another. So wouldn't it make more sense to do 2 separate rankings for each of them instead? Well, Yes, it would. I agree that comparing these acts to each other is very much comparing apples and oranges. I don't even consider Boards of Canada to really be IDM in the way I tend to think of that label. Their style is closer to being a cross between, like, the sounds of 70s synth pioneers with instrumental hip-hop, and there's very little overlap between their style and Aphex Twin's, who is known for much headier and denser and glitchier mixes, or just regular old straightforward ambient music. They do not sound like each other. From a stylistic standpoint, it would frankly make more sense to be ranking Aphex Twin and Oudaker albums together in the same video than it does for Aphex Twin and Boards of Canada. The reason I decided to do it in this specific way is A, I just thought it'd be more fun. B, combining these rankings together felt like a way to make this more actually interesting a discussion than if I just talked about them on their own. And C, like I was just talking about, both acts have discography reviews that I never did album rankings for and feel roughly equally out of date to me. I obviously don't need to do this kind of thing for Oudaker, since not only do I already have a ranking for them, all my videos on them are much more recent from 2020, and that's the point at which I feel like I fully came into my own as a writer, so there's no cringe factor for me to actually watch back on any of those, aside from the old LSEC one, which is way older. So there you go, I'm ranking albums from two separate artists this one time just for this one-off special occasion. Now, on the topic of making the discussion more interesting, there's also the question of what does or doesn't count as albums for the purpose of this ranking. Obviously, there's Boards of Canada's 4 main studio albums and Aphex Twin's 6 main studio albums. But there's obviously more to both of their catalogs than just that, so I decided to include some of their other extracurriculars to flesh things out more. Boards of Canada have their 3 super rare compilations pretty much the whole fanbase knows about of old early material and a few Old Tunes Volume 2 and Random 35 Tracks tape. Those may not be on any streaming services and never will be for copyright reasons, but they're quite easy to find, both via unofficial YouTube uploads from fans and downloadable for free on the fan-run rareboc.org. All pretty much confirmed to be legitimately released material from the brothers themselves, even if in an extremely limited capacity, pretty much just for their family and friends. And with enough material exclusive to them that does not overlap with what they've released more officially, that I felt like I could include them here, unlike the Bach Maxima tape, which has a similar provenance, but a track listing that almost entirely overlaps with Music Has the Right to Children in the High Scores EP. That will not be here. Now, including those releases also means for Aphex Twin I would need to do something similar, so I've included that guy's unreleased Melodies for Mars album here. I also decided to include the 2 regular full-length studio albums he released under other names besides Aphex Twin. So that would be the self-titled Caustic Window album and Polygon Window Surfing on Sine Waves. And as a small bonus for good measure, I've also included that one compilation he released just at the end of last year, since I've never discussed that in video form. But I did skip out on any other compilations, so no Aphex Twin classics, no Chosen Lords under his AFX name, and no Caustic Window compilation. I skipped them out of wanting to make sure my discussion of both acts maintained something closer to an equal balance of screen time. The broader my definition of what to count as an album gets, the more this ranking just becomes overwhelmingly dominated by Aphex Twin, out of his just having released way more music than Boards of Canada. This is also, of course, why EPs are not counted for this ranking, so no Window Liquor and no In a Beautiful Place Out in the Country. And also no Come to Daddy either. The latter is just barely album length, and I've seen included in album rankings before, but to me it mostly feels like a companion piece to what he did better on the Richard D. James album, and less felt like its own thing when I came back to it for this video. The only exception I decided I was willing to make was Twoism. I personally consider that an EP, but it is marked on Discogs as a regular album, or a mini-album sometimes. And considering BOC's Discogs page is probably among the most rigorously double-checked on the site, I was willing to go along with that for the sake of giving these 2 acts more equal representation in this video. Also, I'll concede that Twoism is technically both long enough to feel like an album and does feel more like a complete statement that can be taken on its own. Feel free to argue out the specifics of the way I've handled this ranking in the comments, but it's my ranking. I did this the way I wanted to since I'm doing this for my own channel anniversary. And yeah, everything in this video is obviously just my own subjective opinions, and you can feel free to disagree with them, you know the usual drill, but I think that's more than enough intro, so let's get into it. This is Aphex Twin and Boards of Canada, Worst to Best. At number 18, I have Music from the Merch Desk. Alright, this is the biggest outlier from the rest of the albums in this ranking, a compilation of tracks that, as per the title, were all originally released on exclusive EPs that Aphex Twin had sold at live concerts over the years, which he just put out this past December. It's definitely the least a project included in this video comes to counting as an album, but I included it here, A, because it's the only major release from this guy that I had yet to review, let alone acknowledge on this channel at all, but also, B, to make a certain point and as a framing device to let you know my perspective on where all these other projects line up in comparison to one another. So, anyone who's heard me talk about more recent Aphex Twin releases probably knows exactly where I might be going with this, but just to reconfirm one last time, I personally believe that Richard D. James has not released anything really worth going out of your way to listen to since Cyro in 2014. I mean, best thing he's done since was the one time he decided to let a literal child direct his music video, which was very cute. Also, shout out to that kid who at one point showed up in the comments of my Cheetah review around the time he had turned the same age that I was when I recorded that video for a crazy little full circle moment. Just wanted to digress and mention that because I just find that very cool that happened. But yeah, that's a video. In terms of the actual music, I mean, Cheetah, Collapse, Black Box Life Recorder, Orphan DJ Selec, all this stuff has just always totally run together in the exact same blur of perfectly pleasant and inoffensive but completely forgettable mid-tempo mush with lifeless and directionless melodies that feel like nothing and have no hooks, and musical progressions that feel like he's making stuff up on the fly, just meaningless meandering. Feels like the guy's just been phoning it in for over a decade now, and the music he's turned out in this time is bordered on feeling like it has the passion of an AI-generated content mill. For the record, I know everyone compares everything they don't like to AI these days. It's a lazy, overdone comparison point that I try to avoid when I can, but I do feel like his work has gotten so nondescript and formulaic to the point where such a comparison might actually kind of feel apt. You know it's gotten bad when the title track of Black Box Life Recorder, technically having a melody I can remember, was easily the best thing I'd heard from him post-2014, and that still would have been one of the weakest tracks if it had been included on Cyro. And with the release of this Music from the Merch Desk comp, I feel like all my criticisms of this era of his career have only just been cemented and put on full display for everyone to be able to see more easily. No way to drive the point home than with 38 tracks running on for over 2.5 straight hours, with almost all of it being the exact same mid-tempo meandering slop he's been doing for the last several years. Now, to be fair, there are a couple of actual good moments in there. The comp starts out with two barely distinguishable versions of a track called No Stilson 6 Cirque, which is a pretty solid and hard-hitting 10-minute experimental techno banger that made good use of its length. The track T16.5 Madma with Nastia has a pretty good emotional tune with a lot of nice reverby atmosphere, I guess. The track Night Mail has a repetitive vocal sample which makes for an actually properly catchy earworm hook. That's 3 actual properly good tracks which are all noticeably better than Black Box Life Recorder for me. But that's kind of it. There's other decent stuff here and there. Tracks like these are nice in a less specific way. And to be absolutely clear, none of this stuff is outright awful or anything. All of it is pleasant and listenable, and if you're cool with more and more of the same Cyro vibe, then you'll get lots of that. Also, the album cover meant to look like a bootleg 2000s Gangsta Grillz mixtape. I think it even came from, like a bootleg t-shirt. That is pretty funny. But I just found the listening experience to be kinda boring, forgettable, and flavorless more than anything. And with all these other releases he's put out that are just doing the exact same thing again and again and again, it just feels like he's not even trying anymore. Now look, there may not be any crime in settling into a late period niche and no longer putting out the kind of innovative, game-changing work that he's known for. I don't need him to make another 85-92 level era-defining classic or anything. But out of the old IDM legends who've settled down into their legacy era, I feel like Aphex Twins has been quite handily the most disappointing out of all of them. Mike Paradinas and Square Pusher aren't exactly making modern classics right now, but they still have lots of good tunes, and still sound like they're having fun, and have been making sure to never make the exact same album twice. Grush and Be Up a Hello cut it very close, but both at least had enough good tunes to get away with it. Plaid, they may have been fundamentally making the exact same album over and over since the 90s, but their core formula is more than multidimensional enough with differing enough execution from album to album to make sure a new release from them can still be intriguing, and some of their best albums are also some of their most recent ones. Hell, I didn't really care for either of Autaker's last two albums and thought those were probably their most inessential work yet, but they're still doing stuff that no other artists in existence are doing in quite the same way. I may have personally found Sign to be dull and lifeless, but it was at least a comparatively risky swerve coming from them in particular. And plus, even though I found that poorly paced, inconsistent, and also kind of predictable, I still believe that has more quality by percentage than anything RDJ's put out lately. I at least very easily get why other people love those. And I hate to say it, Boards of Canada may not have released any new music at all since 2013, but at least in doing so, they've never embarrassed themselves or cheapened their legacy. I'd still prefer their path of inactivity over Aphex Twin having gotten so boring, half-assed, and samey in recent years, where I've run out of anything notable to talk about, and the track record getting so consistently mediocre that I don't even feel like I have anything to look forward in new releases from him at all anymore. Okay, I got a little angry here. Maybe some of these comments got a little harsh. If it sounds like I absolutely hate this whole era of Aphex Twin, I really don't. I just think it's like really middle of the road and doesn't provide anything interesting to talk about. I mean, if I were scoring this comp, it would probably be like a solid 5 out of 10. All the comparisons I've made to other fellow IDM legends are meant to come off more as like favorable to what they're doing rather than disparaging of what RDJ is doing. If you do still get an exciting experience out of either this comp or anything else this guy's put out after Cyro, that's great. I don't want to take that away from you. But I ran out of patience with this guy years ago. And all this needs to be said to highlight that there is a noticeable gap in quality between Aphex Twin's entire post-Cyro era and everything else I'm going to talk about in this video going forward. So let's talk about some music much more actually worth caring about, in my opinion. Whoopsh. At number 17, I have Twoism. Oof, okay. I know I made a special one-off exception for this, including a project that I personally consider more of an EP. I'm able to concede there is enough meat to this where I could see why others would count it as a regular album, but I don't think I'm gonna be making anyone happy with my placement of it. Before you come at me, again, there is a noticeable gap between this and Music for the Merch Desk for me. For one thing, it came out in 1995 during the time when the IDM scene was still in its formative years, instead of being the literal poster boy for all my least favorite aspects of an artist's late period stagnation. So automatically, this is obviously going to get much more of a pass from me. You can hear their unique style clearly forming with the low-key bubbly synth melodies going up against steady bouncing hip-hop beats. Very much the exact kind of sound I think of when I think of Boards of Canada in passing. But the mixes they were delivering at this point were very bare bones, and the listening experience is pretty limp and background music-y, evoking the feel of just being tired and hungover all day and not really being that fun to sit through. Or maybe having freaking vertigo and bad headaches for an entire week. Which, if that's the vibe you're in the mood for, it'll hit effectively, though really more importantly, it's kind of a collection of ideas they would significantly improve upon on High Scores and Music Has the Right to Children, and aren't executed in even close to as memorable a way, at least for me. 69er is a good tune I can remember easily, quite handily my favorite track here, but they also kind of repurposed a similar mix of sounds for Everything You Do Is a Balloon that just felt significantly deeper and more striking to me. The title track is kind of a less good companion to 69er. Tracks like Bass Free and Iced Cooley feel like attempts to get their sound to fit in the existing IDM and ambient techno frameworks Warp was really pushing at the time, and don't feel as unique to them specifically. The former may have had some more energy behind it at least, but would have easily fit on any Aphex Twin EP released around that time or earlier without being a particular highlight. See You Later and Smoke's Quantity are nice, smoky, and mysterious sounding cuts that both hit better when they were directly included on High Scores and Music Has the Right to Children respectively, and the rest just kind of go in one ear and out the other for me. I'm also told Chris Horn, aka Christ, contributed to some of this project as well. That guy would go on to have his own decently well-received solo career, of which I've not actually heard anything yet. I'll have to check him out at some point. Though I wouldn't be able to tell you how much of a difference his input really made. I wouldn't have been able to tell someone else besides the Sandinsons contributed if I didn't already know. So yeah, there may be some historical value to this one for being possibly the first ever project that could be considered lo-fi beats to study to. Certainly anyone who knowingly makes something in that genre will have definitely been directly inspired by these guys, if not just sometimes inspired by this one project in particular. But chances are more of the loads that Copycat's BOC inspired will have been inspired by the even more popular EP and album that would immediately follow it over this early blueprint of formulas the duo themselves would do much better later. This is still decent for what it is, certainly very ahead of its time. It obviously has loads of fans willing to go to bat for it as among their best work, and I presume will be yelling at me about this placement in the comments. But I never feel compelled to actually go back to this one myself. I think it just beats out Trans-Canada Highway as my least favorite project they released in an official capacity. So, yeah, it's okay. Whoopsh. At number 16, I have Melodies from Mars. So how about some stuff released in an unofficial capacity? This was a tape of an as-of-now unreleased album that RDJ gave out to his friends. At various times he's teased on and off the idea of releasing it in a more official capacity, although nothing's ever come of it. Though unofficial YouTube rips of it are quite easy to find. It's a pretty decent collection of playful and quirky tunes, which are all pretty easily accessible, and the final effect doesn't just sound exactly like other records he's put out. There is an identity to this album that you don't get out of any of his other stuff, even if the album shares 2 tracks in common with the Richard D. James album, but this clearly isn't on the same level as that project. I mean, I do quite like the shimmering, spacey tones of track 4, the brighter 8-bit video game synths on track 10, the squirty propulsiveness of track 11, and the return of the MIDI pizzicato strings on track 12. Everything else maintains a generally cheerful and quirky mood that's easy to get into, though it doesn't really go that deep with these ideas, and most of the experience falls in the background really easily for me. The more times I've put this on trying to figure out where it falls in the ranking, the less enthused I was by the material on display here. At best, I'd have to call this project a side curiosity, and there's nothing absolutely essential here. There is a part of me who can kinda see why this got shelved, since I wouldn't put any of this up to snuff with the material on his other main studio albums. But it's not bad either, and more importantly, it's not redundant. So, if you just want RDJ at his most playful side with a looser and more laid-back feel, then maybe give it a shot. It's alright. But while we're on the topic of unreleased side curiosities, whoosh, at number 15, I have A Few Old Tunes. Alright, this one. Back when I first heard this project in 2017, I likened it to reading someone's diary, hearing private unpolished archives with crappier cassette rip audio quality that sounded like they weren't ready, let alone willing to show off to the public. Coming back to hear this in full for the first time 8 years later, I no longer view this stuff to be outright embarrassing or worthy of burying. There's clearly enough gems here to still be worth a listen for those curious enough. Now the main thing this reminds me of is, I guess, projects I've heard from the $10 tier of my Patreon, where any small-time, no-budget artist can pay for me to check out a release they made and give them feedback in the form of a text post. Which has led me to hear a lot of projects from, like, teenagers making their own music for the first time before really knowing what they were doing yet. Back in the day, I also compared this album to Jean-Michel Jarre's Deserted Palace, and that comparison very much still stands. A legendary act still in the process of learning how to do this whole electronic music thing before more ambitious and better honed down stuff would follow. This is a very amateurish version of BOC, who have absolutely no concept of tonal cohesion, throwing together loud, barely edited samples from TV shows and commercials and other already existing songs and bouncing them off super minimal, unfinished ambient sketches. And there's just no rhyme or reason to anything. But at least unlike Twoism, the resulting experience is anything but boring. And I now find the flagrant disregard for copyright and the constantly pulling up loads of obviously uncleared samples willy-nilly to be part of the fun. I used to hear a track like The Way You Show, which fades from all these semi-shrill chipmunk voice samples into a blatant sample of Celebration by Kool and the Gang, with absolutely nothing else to do with those ideas. Or track like PC, which has some kind of 80s background music with all these heavy breathing noises that vaguely resemble a woman's orgasms if you kind of squint at it, I guess. And I was left mildly baffled and wondering who the hell would want to listen to this. Now I can get some charm out of what is clearly the result of teenagers joking around and having a bit of harmless fun. I knew that's exactly what it was back in 2017 too, but I have grown to appreciate the pure unhinged wackiness and sense of humor to these old tapes comps that aren't present on any of their officially released material. However, even if I feel like I get this tape more now, I wouldn't say I enjoy this tape any more or less than when I reviewed it. I still find it extremely hit and miss, just now I find the boatloads of ambient sketches closer to the style you'd already expect from them to be more the actual weak points, for just not really being that interesting. There's some tracks I still like, and had kept around to come back to occasionally over the last several years. The squirty barebones 80s electro-adjacent mix of Forest Moon, the plastic proto-vaporwavy Spectrum, the wiry cinematic ambience of Skimming Stones, the shifting paths and skittering sequences of Affinity, the sparse thumping and eerie melodies of Mansell, or the exceptionally pretty and melodic 5978. But tracks like these I did like enough to keep longer term are the exception and not the norm, among a track listing absolutely chock full of abortive fragments that don't go anywhere, and don't have enough of substance to leave an impression or give me anything to say about them if I even notice they're there at all. This is still a pretty good comp that has a specific playful appeal that isn't present on their official releases, and again I was rarely bored by the experience, but I wouldn't call it their best or most essential work either. It's a side curiosity for the superfans. And while we're directly on that topic, whoosh, at number 14, I have Random 35 Tracks Tape. Now, this tape I seem to recall enjoying a lot more than the other two unreleased BOC comps when I first heard it, and yet it didn't really hold up as well as I remembered on return visits. This tape, indeed consisting of a random selection of 35 tracks, is both its biggest strength and its biggest weakness. In one breath, it's an hour and a half of Boards of Canada demos, none of which sound alike, and as such the experience will once again never be boring. You can get ambient doodles, fragments that would make the cut for more official releases, you can get random breakbeat workouts or frantic techno cuts, tracks that sound like warped 80s pop tunes, a few handfuls of random samples and manipulations thereof, even some kinda mildly shoegaze-inspired rock-leaning cuts, and also plenty of tracks which are odd combinations of any of these ideas. You never really know what you'll get next when you put this on. On the other hand, it's also an hour and a half of Boards of Canada demos, with absolutely no regard for pacing or structure or sequencing or anything like that. And they are all clearly demos. Most of these tracks don't even sound finished. There's not really one overarching mood to sink yourself into. Although I guess the wild pivots in sound and style do border on just becoming the mood themselves. It certainly hits on that specific appeal Boards of Canada are known for, of feeling like you're uncovering lost media memories stashed away in the attic of some relative, which might be funny, might be spooky, might be nostalgic, might not make any sense to you at all. In fact, of the three unreleased BOC comps I've included here, this is the one that feels the most BOC-like. But I also can't say nearly any of these fragments are all that memorable on their own either. The only tracks from here I can consistently remember that don't just appear on other projects of theirs, official or not, are those two solo acoustic guitar cuts, A10 and B04. The melodies of those really stuck in my mind longer term, and they do hit on a particular warm nostalgic note that seems predictive of what they do on the Campfire Head phase. Some people have theorized that they come from that lost Play-by-Numbers EP. But everything else is just an unpredictable roulette wheel. Quirky energetic synth noodling like on A03, or given a more introverted spin on B18, compressed thumping breaks and barely audible playful jazzy keyboard melodies on B07, meandering ambient pads and a thuddingly repetitive sample of filtered percussion on A08, rocking out with distorted guitars on A07, a reversed version of the small weirdest number from GeoGaddy, a possible early version of their track 747 with absolutely no pulse or power like the final version, and made to sound completely empty on A06, a freaking Indonesian gamelan type thing on B08, ending with a weird 30-second quirky clown tune in B20 as a complete anticlimax. Seemingly anything goes as long as it sounds scrappy and directionless enough. I can't deny that the sheer variety on display makes for a fun listen, and the fact that a lot of these tracks only work because they're another unpredictable turn in the greater context of such a random roulette wheel of a tape does in some way make it easier to respect than a few old tunes. It's the kind of thing that hits better if you just sit through the whole thing in one go. But when you really get down to it, these tapes hit on the exact same level pretty much. A few old tunes has both higher high points and lower low points. It's a difficult thing to judge, especially considering nobody really knows its origin or who assembled it. But at the end of the day, I think I'd say this is a merely pretty good side curiosity for superfans and not necessarily essential listening. Whoopsh. And number 13, I have Surfing on Sine Waves. Alright, well, this is an actual finished and officially released album with actual intentions behind its sequencing and structure, and an actual fully polished mastering job instead of just being a leaked tape of unknown provenance and potato quality audio. So, big step up right off the bat. But we are still inside curiosity territory at this point. Surfing on Sine Waves may be RDJ's contribution to Warp Records' legendary Artificial Intelligence series that pretty much set the standards for home listening ambient techno formulas that are still consistently copied from all the time, up through present day. Although, unlike that other more famous earlier project he made that's known for setting the gold standard for this specific genre, and still overshadows most ambient techno releases coming out to this day, I don't know if this project would feel quite as special in the greater context of the genre if it were to come out right now. I view it to just be a very solid project and not an exemplary one. For one thing, I think this album is very much front-loaded, and with all the best and most memorable cuts in the first half. The tracks Polygon Window and Audax Powder are famous ambient techno standards with pretty iconic melodies and round bass lines and pads that have stuck around in people's memories. Quath is a heavy and more industrial-leaning banger that I have come around on a lot and enjoy way more than I did when I first covered this in my very first Odds and Ends. And If It Really Is Me has lots of very pretty MIDI piano-driven melodies. All of these first 4 cuts are great. The rest of the project is nice, but not really that memorable for me. Tracks like Supremacy 2, UT1 Dot, Untitled, and Quixote may all have solid banging techno beats, plenty of energy, cool, dark, and mildly futuristic melodies, and some neat acid squelching here and there. All decently striking and enjoyable while they're playing in the moment, but they all kind of run together into the same mix without feeling that distinct from each other, and disappear from my head once they're done. And while Quinofec is a serviceable, entirely ambient closer to the project, it's also not one of the most striking of his entirely ambient works. Overall, this album's quite good, and it has its classic moments for sure. There's just plenty of other even better stuff of the same ilk out there. It's not even one of the better projects to come out of Warp's Artificial Intelligence series. I mean, Outakir's Incunabula, Speedy J's Ginger, and Fuse's Dimension Intrusion I think are all better. Though it's not the worst of that series either. I like this more than, say, B12's Electrosoma, or the 2 various artist comps that bookended the series. Not sure whether I prefer this over Black Dog Productions' Bites. I think they're about on the same level. Haven't listened to that one in a while. But yeah, Surfing on Sine Waves may not be a must-listen for me, but it is a good album, and it's got its moments. And if you want an even better side curiosity, whoopsh. And number 12, I have the Caustic Window LP. I quite like this album. For a record that RDJ decided to shelve and then only released in a limited capacity after a crowdfunding campaign 20 years after the fact, it holds up a lot better than you would think. I never used to be that much of a fan of the heavier and more abrasive banger side of Aphex Twin's work, and for the record I'd be lying if I said I still don't find some of his stuff in that vein to just not be that interesting. There's a reason Classics or the Caustic Window compilation aren't in this ranking, but the material he set aside for this LP in particular turned out to be really fun. Tracks here can be somewhat harsh and abrasive sometimes, but they never feel too monotonous or headache-inducing, and the underlying grooves tend to be more than danceable enough to pull me in anyway. See the epic acid techno of cuts like Stomper 101 Mod D-Tune Kick, other blown-out stompers like Rev Pop or Airflow, the interlude Popeye, which kind of has this quirky bud-cutting style of beatwork that reminds me of Mike Paradinus' work from around that time, or the even more completely distorted mixes of Flaps and C-Word I shouldn't say because I'm American. But there were plenty of other playful and fun ideas that just weren't focused on being balls-to-the-wall bangers. I really like the Wacky Races samples on Mumbly and the cartoonish energy they bring to that mix. There's other tracks that allow him to go back into his more melodic side, like the mildly chill laid-back tunes of Flutie, the bright pianos and acid synths on Squidge in the Fridge, the more atmospheric acid mixes on Fingery, and the mildly dreamlike sequences of 101 Rainbows. Also, the cut of phone pranks at the end is mildly entertaining. Not gonna say all of it hits for me. I used to like Jazz Phase, but I think the oily acid bass doesn't really tonally fit well next to the jazzy electric piano chords. It doesn't really sound that great in retrospect. And there's just a bunch of other tracks which aren't that memorable in context. The experience can run together a bit on average. Also, as many solid hitters as there are here, I don't think there's any individual cut on this album I'd put among, like, the absolute best work RDJ's ever done. There's no outright clunkers, but also no all-time greats on here. But it is very consistent and an all-around fun listen that I can't complain too much about. The bangers bang, the melodic tracks are all fun. It's got a decent amount of variety to keep me interested. If this were a mainline Aphex Twin album, I feel like it would have been roughly as well remembered as this next pick, which, you know, might be a bit more famous. Whoopsh. And number 11, I have I Care Because You Do. Alright, let's finally talk about some real mainline studio albums. And my least favorite of the 10 of those I have to pick from probably won't be surprising anyone. My feelings on this one have not super fundamentally changed since I reviewed it. The album certainly starts great in its first third, tracks like Acrid Avid Jam Shred, The Wax and Piff, Wax the Nip, and Ictedral provide increasingly hard-hitting mixes of crunchy techno beats and hip-hop break beats, floaty dreamlike melodies, and the occasional synth strings. And the album obviously ends even better than it starts. Alberto Balsalm is obviously one of the all-time most iconic melodic downtempo tracks, like, ever. And Cowcut as a Twin is still my personal favorite on the album, with its even filthier and grimier breakbeats, giving some real edge and texture to an otherwise much more uplifting set of bubbling synth washes. And Next Teep With shows one of his first attempts to go in a modern classical-inspired direction, switching off between haunting organ pads and MIDI pizzicato strings. All this stuff is great, nobody needs me to tell them this. Now, the section in the middle... yes, still not crazy about the middle stretch. Still cannot deal with Ventolin or its piercing tinnitus ringing. Still don't like Start As You Mean To Go On or its extra harsh and monotonous industrial techno mix that goes absolutely nowhere beyond its one bare-bones initial idea. A lot of people have highlighted to me that the ear-scraping qualities of those two tracks are the primary appeal for them. Good for you if you feel that way. I don't. Beyond that, I'm ambivalent on Moo Kid and its kinda mild mid-tempo sludginess. I wasn't even feeling Wet Tip Hand X as much as I expected on Return Listen either. The string melodies are still cool, it's just not as good as the similar sounding cuts in the first third of the album. I did come around on Come On You Slags on Return Visit though. A lot of nice hard-hitting break beats on that one, which are pretty satisfying. I mean, overall, this is still a good album, and I suppose one could give it points for, I guess, general inventiveness and the fact that it's more the thing that only Aphex Twin could make as popular as it was. Though I stand by it really not being as radical as some people say it is. I've seen people talk about this like they think RDJ literally invented industrial techno, which he did not. I mean, just for one example, Jeff Mills and early Underground Resistance were doing similar stuff that set the stage for an album like this to exist. I'd also argue Mike Paradinas was doing this sound a lot better before this and making it a lot more exciting. Tango Invective absolutely wipes the floor with this album. But that's obviously not a real criticism. An album obviously doesn't need to literally be a game changer to be enjoyable. And I do get that this was a lot of people's introduction to these kinds of sounds. Myself included in some specific areas. So I suppose there's some inevitable nostalgia bias going to be there. Really, this album's worst crime for me is just being an all-over-the-place mixed bag. The kind of thing I come back to just for specific moments, but almost never listen to the whole thing front to back. The Caustic Window LP may not have the high points nearly as high as the best ones on here, but I do personally view that record to be a little more consistent as a whole. But I still have to rank this one above all these other projects since A, the best moments here still keep me coming back to them repeatedly out of context for years, and B, even the moments I don't like have kind of been imbued with this level of iconic importance for the genre anyway. Depending on your taste, there'll be easy arguments to make for people to mark this as one of their big favorites in his catalog, if not just their favorite overall that I wouldn't really be able to argue with, since that really just comes down to personal taste. But if we're talking about my own personal taste, I like it, but I don't love it. And number 10, I have Tomorrow's Harvest. Speaking of projects I only like and don't love, well, I'll say this album has grown on me a fair bit since my review of it. Back when I covered it, I felt like it was so forgettable to the point of constantly going in one ear and out the other on nearly every listen, save for 2 or 3 isolated moments, and that number of isolated moments has increased to at least 8-ish by now, which is just enough for the experience to not feel like it's running together into nothing anymore. First it was pretty much just Nothing Is Real and its brighter spot of more colorful optimism, with maybe some of the more striking arpeggios of White Cyclosa and chiming chords of New Seeds, though soon the lumbering off-kilter groove of Jacquard Causeway was able to join it, as were the thumping evolutions of Palace Posy, the most deserted of all the interludes in You Ritual. Obviously, both of the driest and heaviest album bookends, Reach for the Dead and Come to Dust. Maybe a little bit of the lonely minimal intro and outro Gemini and Semena Mrtvike, even if the former I mainly tend to just remember for the initial synth horn jingle. Bit on and off with the spacier and breezier approach to Split Your Infinities, which don't stick out on every listen, but are consistently quite nice. And even if I wouldn't call Telepath a highlight by any stretch, I can at least kind of remember the garbled, barely audible counting voice on it, which is something. So that's actually quite a lot of highlights now. I feel like it did take a decent bit of concerted effort on my part to actually get to that point, which I might not have gotten to if this had come from a much smaller artist or outfit that didn't have such a huge cult following to peer pressure me into giving it as many shots as I did after the fact. But that peer pressuring did technically work. I did in fact get to a point with it where I can actually put this on for fun because I'm actually in the mood to be taken through its post-apocalyptic wasteland journey instead of just trying again in the hopes of getting it this time. And I now enjoy this more than an Aphex Twin album that features some of my all-time favorite tracks that guy ever made. It's very solid, and unlike I Care Because You Do, I'm not going to skip anything here, and I take no issue with the way it's structured as a complete whole. But yeah, even after all this time, I have to be honest and still mark it as my least favorite of BOC's 4 main studio albums. There's still a lot of cuts here that go in one ear and out the other, not just the minimal synth interludes, which aren't really their most striking in their vein, such as Transmissiones Ferox or Collapse, but also some of the longer cuts like Sick Times and Cold Earth fall into the background super easily for me. There are still entire stretches of this album I'm liable to mostly just tune out, and even in a lot of its best moments, I just can't say much of this album is their strongest work from a melodic standpoint. Also, despite how many cuts have managed to click with me over the years, I still believe this is the least unique Boards of Canada record. The kind of thing that lots of different synth artists, either newer or much older than BOC themselves, could quite easily recapture the effect of. Anyone trying to make a synth soundtrack to some kind of post-apocalyptic sci-fi movie would probably end up somewhere along similar lines to this album. So, no, I still don't think this album is properly great, let alone up to par with their biggest classics, and I don't think it ever will be for me. It has grown on me, and I have come to appreciate it for what it is. I do come back to it every now and then, but I do feel like they have plenty more interesting work than this. For example, at number 9, I have The Campfire Head Phase. You know, there was a part of me who was half expecting this album to rank below Tomorrow's Harvest when I first started writing this video, since This is almost certainly the main BOC album I listen to the least frequently. When I'm in the mood for a project to hit me on the kind of mood this album hits on, of this warmer electro-acoustic blend combining ambient electronics with guitars and all these post-rock and shoegaze influences, I might think to put on some Bibio Silver Wilkinson, or maybe some M83. Maybe some Finnes, too, although I only just recently got into that guy for the first time a few months ago. His place in my regular listening rotation hasn't really been cemented yet. I often forget just how well Boards of Canada were able to hit upon this specific niche, because this album is so different from what they're typically known for, and such a departure from the kinds of sounds and moods that come to mind when one thinks about this duo's work in passing. And the fact that it is such a major departure and one that's this well executed is why I decided to rank it above Tomorrow's Harvest. That album was more or less BOC doing exactly what you would have expected them to do at that point in time, but this one actively challenged their core listener base and put them out of their comfort zone. Not to mention it was a new direction that I suspect they were particularly passionate about. So in that sense, I just always had a lot more respect for what they did here over what they did on Tomorrow's Harvest. And as much as I've come to enjoy that album, the first third of this album still has way higher high points than anything on there. That 4-track run of the energetic guitar chops and floaty synths of Chroma Key Dreamcoat, the warm psychedelic folk atmosphere of Satellite Anthem Icarus, the even more light and sunny and breezy Peacock Tale with all its super nice vibraphone melodies, and of course Day Van Cowboy with all its shifting sections, expansive cinematic folk flavored synth soundscapes, and dense breakbeat workouts at the end. That whole run is unmatched. And if the rest of the album had been able to maintain the same level of quality of that first third, this would have much easily been even higher in the ranking, and probably become the kind of thing I'd remember to put on more often. But yeah, those structural issues are still there. After Dave Van Cowboy, the album kinda ran out of different ideas to offer and cycled through variations of the same ones, which to be fair didn't necessarily come with a noticeable drop in quality. You'll still get some highlights such as 84 Pontiac Dream and Hey Saturday Sun, but the album also gradually decreases in energy level over the course of its running time as the compositions got more flighty and less individually striking, until finally culminating in still in my opinion the most anticlimax way in Farewell Fire, an 8-minute entirely ambient closer which has 3 full minutes of near silent fade out. Still don't care for that ending, sorry, I still think it kinda kills the mood. And I still think the Japanese exclusive bonus track Macquarie Ridge is a far better finish. I suppose the way this album is structured and the way its energy level builds up and down and further down is comparable to Keeping Up a Campfire, letting it burn brighter in the beginning but slowly dying down with the occasional firewood tossed in for a bit more fleeting energy until all of it just finally slows down and gets put out. That's a neat concept, but it does make for less than ideal pacing and a clearly front-loaded experience. So yeah, some of the best moments of the duo's entire career are here. Lots of beautiful synth-inflected post-rock productions to go around that leave me wondering why on earth I don't put them on more often anytime I do put them on. And the new direction was a legit risk that paid off for them. But it's not as big of a home run as their previous classics. Probably not surprising anyone with my take on this one, pretty much feel the exact same way I did on it when I reviewed it. But what might surprise people is my new take on this next pick, which did turn out very different from my feelings back in 2017. At number 8, I have Old Tunes Volume 2. Yeah, so my feelings on this and the random 35 tracks tape pretty much swapped with each other on my most recent revisits. I used to think the latter was easily my favorite of the 3 back in the day, but now coming back to re-examine them years later, I think Old Tunes Volume 2 turned out to be the real gem of the unreleased tapes for me. I feel like this was the collection that just happened to have the most life and energy and creativity put into it. And while it's probably also the tape that least exemplifies the kinds of sounds you typically expect out of BOC, it's more in the fun way. There's just a level of unpredictability to the experience that keeps it exciting. It's got the same playful sense of humor and complete irreverence towards copyright that the first Old Tunes tape had, but doesn't sound quite as amateurish or basic to me, and the ideas being presented are much more consistently interesting and maintain my attention over much more of the full running time. Still doing the approach of throwing loads of shit at the wall to see what sticks, but whether intentional or not, feel like they're actually adding up to something greater than the sum of their parts instead of constantly killing each other's vibes. Back in 2017, I compared it to watching the YouTube channel Grand Illusions. Just watching a charming little showcase of all sorts of different toys and novelty items from across all sorts of different places and eras. Except, instead of being presented by a nostalgic old man, it's being presented by some guys presumably in either their teenage years or early 20s, just kind of screwing around and happening upon a lot of weird experimental ideas and fun melodies. Smashing together samples from news broadcasts, TV shows, and commercials like on Iraq Says, Apparatus, or Peace Tony Devil. Devil does hit better here than it did in Old Tunes Volume 1. Slowed down spacey 80s pop and more proto-vaporwave frameworks seen on We've Started Up or Dave I'm a Real Traditionalist. Manipulated TV soundtrack beds that sound pulled out of the 60s and 70s, like Sir Prancelot Brainfire or Iced Cooley Beatnik. Crashing break beats combined with energetic vocal chops on Staircase Whip, or a similarly dense psychedelic mix of mellotrons, stretched out vocal loops, and crunchy beats on the Wind. But this stuff is far from being unrecognizable as Boards of Canada's work. Especially on the second half of the project, you start to run into a lot more of the style you're used to. Not just a moment like Orange Hexagon Sun, which takes the same beat from its similarly titled Turquoise variant, and builds completely different but equally effective melodies on top. But there's a healthy mix of their experimental hip-hop and early IDM styles seen on the glitchy and unnerving Mukinabat, the compressed beats and chimes of Xander 2, or the warmer and more playful BMX track in Bucky High, combined with intriguingly mysterious ambient fragments like Kite Racer 2 or Powerline Misfortune. The latter's particularly stuck around in my mind longer term as low-key one of their best minimal synth sketches. Not to say it's all great all the way through. When you got an album of 36 unfinished sketches, it's inevitable you run into lots of fragments that are so underdeveloped to not even be worth mentioning. Just like loose synth bass lines or arpeggios that play for less than a minute and that kind of thing. There's a lot of tracks that are just that. But I feel like they're paced much better, where if an idea doesn't interest you in the moment, then the next one will be coming up right around the corner. Again, I'm not sure if I properly love it, but it's right there on the border of greatness for me. Even if it sometimes feels like they may have stumbled upon some of the crazy or unpredictable appeal on accident, it retains enough of the exact kind of appeal you'd want out of Boards of Canada, and showcase the kind of creative talent they had early on, in a particular way that I can't get out of any of their other projects or unreleased tapes, in my opinion. Now, if you want an experience that delivers similar childlike playfulness and wilder unpredictability in a much more intentional feeling and economical package, there's always this next pick. At number 7, I have the Richard D. James album. And now I feel like we're really getting into the meat of this ranking and the stuff people come to a video like this to hear about. Also here we have another one of the reasons I decided to include side projects and comps in this ranking, since if this video only concerned main studio albums, this would technically be ranked in the bottom half, which would both be selling this album short as well as make a lot of people unhappy. This might have become one of the more common picks people go with for number 1 best Aphex Twin album overall lately, especially given the way more compact package, presenting a wide variety of ideas that feels dense and complex but also super concise at just over a half-hour total. Certainly stands apart compared to other albums of his that can run on for over 2 hours. For me personally, the super compact length is honestly the main reason why this isn't ranked even higher. I tend to prefer the albums of his that have more sprawl and meat to them than this can provide. And even though there's technically a version with 5 extra bonus tracks that allows this to feel like more of a substantial experience, in my opinion those bonus tracks do more to hinder the experience than add to it. I do like Milkman, got a good tune, mildly amusing conceits. But the other 4 tracks barely add anything and just make the ending a lot more anticlimax feeling, so yeah, album is better in its original 10-track half-hour length form. I'll freely admit I don't actually feel compelled to put this one on too often, but when I do, I have fun with it all the way through. The more emotional moments and faux classical drum and bass crossovers may still hit among the best for me, like For and Girl Boy Song and Goon Goompas, especially the former of those three. Tracks like Finger Bib, To Cure a Weakling Child, and to a somewhat lesser extent Yellow Calx add that playful whimsicality, the latter two of those combining solid melodies with denser beatwork and experimentation. And the former of those three cuts, while I still wouldn't consider a major favorite of mine, it definitely hits better in the context of this album than it does on Melodies from Mars. It's more in its element on Melodies from Mars, but this just, I guess it's more surprising and striking here. Hits a little better. Now, I've also come to appreciate the denser, less melodic, and more experimental-leaning moments from this thing more on return visit. I don't think the album would work as well as it does if tracks like Cornish Acid, Carnmarth, or Peak 824505201 weren't here to take the sound into more exciting and unpredictable places. And yes, my favorite track on the album is still the closer, Logan Rockwitch. It may be absolutely buck wild to finish on a track almost entirely made out of what sounds like Hanna-Barbera-style cartoon sound effects, but somehow it really sticks the landing and makes it feel satisfying. This may not be one of my more frequently listened to Aphex Twin albums, but I more or less have the same standpoint on this one that I had in my review years ago, which is to say, I do still view it to be a great album that still feels sufficiently fleshed out and complete even at its short length, and I can easily understand why this is a much bigger favorite for so many other people. There just happen to be other projects from him that have taken more of a personal meaning for me than this, including one that I imagine might surprise some people who remember where I stood in my original reviews. And number 6, I have Cyro. Ah, Cyro. This is an album I have come to develop a weird, bittersweet relationship with. At the time, it might have been an exciting comeback, albeit one that I found to be kind of a letdown when it first came out, as it didn't actually see him doing anything he hadn't already done lots of times before. The kind of thing that, made all too much sense to see win a Grammy in retrospect. It may be easily the most experimental record ever to win that particular award, but it's clear RDJ only got it because his legacy and influence had become too toweringly important to ignore. No artist actually on the cutting edge in this genre and still in their prime is ever going to be winning Grammy accolades, let's be real. By the time I put out my review of the album about 2 years after the fact, it had grown on me a significant amount, and I could at least call it really good, but I still didn't want to call it great or imply that RDJ was somehow doing something essential or game-changing just by merely continuing to exist as so many fans were pretty much hyping him up to do. But now it's been over a decade since Cyro. As I went over near the beginning of this video, obviously, I feel like the guy's been putting out a whole bunch of half-baked filler in the time since this project came out. My disappointment in all things Cheetah, Collapse, Black Box Life Recorder, or whatever else may keep growing with each passing year, each new obligatory dump of even more leftovers that sound exactly the same as all the others. But Cyro itself does still hold up to me, and if anything, all the filler he's pumped out in the decade since has only highlighted the actual passion and thought and craft put into this record, which I don't get to the same extent out of any of his stuff after this point. This feels to me like the last project where he really gave a fuck about what he was doing. In a universe where RDJ didn't fall off for me after this album, Cyro would probably be his equivalent to what his friend Music did with Magic Pony Ride in 2022. An album that emotionally reflects RDJ's place in life of just having settled down and focused on his family and kids, no longer even trying to be on the cutting edge, but still finding some special resonance in his laid-back middle age. But in this universe where his career went the direction it did, Cyro feels like that, on top of also feeling like his final swan song before unofficially retiring. Every track on the album just kind of evokes the feeling of just taking a walk out in a public park or something. Just a lot of nice and pleasant vibes. And while I may have initially found the results to mostly feel like aimless, hookless meandering, aside from the occasional catchier moment like Mini Pop 67 or 180dB, compared to the kind of aimless meandering his stuff afterwards could go on, this stuff may as well feel like crazy prog rock epics with loads of cool attention-grabbing twists and details on every track. I have come to appreciate even the most hookless tracks on the album, like Circlant 6A or the Earth Portal one I don't feel like pronouncing, since even if they don't exactly stick in my mind, they can always find ways to mildly excite me through their dense complexities. And the album is far from being hookless either. I do suspect RDJ may have been half joking when he originally advertised it as being his pop record, but really you kind of just gotta do a bit of work to find the hooks and let those little moments, like the breathy vocals near the end of Circlon 14, the squelchy chords of Pat Pat 4, or the semi-funky buzzing synth riffs of the sorta titled track, sit with you for longer as they start to further grow on you. Although yeah, my favorite tracks on the album are still the same favorites that I had when I first heard the album in 2014. Mini Pop 67 is still my easy favorite, as that tune that just easily sticks in my mind, and the poster boy track for melancholy middle-aged IDM. And its 10-minute continuation, Xmas Eve at 10, kinda jams with the same sort of core ideas as that opener, and takes it into more than enough cool places and emotional notes to fully justify that length. I still think 180 dB is a banger, even if it's way more straightforward and repetitive than anything else on the album. And of course, the solo piano closer I Sat Santa is the perfect note his album career could end on. This final, poignant farewell lullaby that only gets to me more with each passing year. I still don't have it in me to call Cyro an all-timer. It is still one of those projects with those certain moments that hit for me a lot more than others, and anytime I put it on, it just kind of makes me sad. But at this point, I think I can definitively call it great. I'd probably score it more like an 8.3 nowadays instead of the 7.7 I gave it in my initial review. It has in fact come to mean something special to me as I've gotten older myself. And now only the obvious actual all-time greats rank above it, so let's get to those real all-timers now, shall we? Whoopsh. At number 5, I have GeoGaddy. Okay, so all of these top 5 albums in the ranking obviously already notch spots in my old greatest of all time lists from 2016, and I enjoy all of them on a roughly comparable level, so don't take the fact that I only have this ranked at number 5 too much to heart. I'm well aware this will most likely be a lot of people's number 1 pick, and if that is your pick, I would not be able to argue with that. But I will admit that no matter what kind of mood I'm in, there's absolutely no spot in this ranking that this album would have possibly gone in except for number 5. Absolutely no higher and no lower. It's an album that's always been on the border of being a 9 out of 10. An album I still put on semi-regularly and enjoy all the way through every time I do. An album I can categorize as a towering classic that deserves every bit of the accolades it's gotten, with tons of obvious influence over this entire genre I love the most. A wildly creative blend of instrumental hip-hop, nostalgic old-school 70s synth throwbacks, and other well-textured experimental down-tempo blends, adding up to lots of highly varied ideas that all add up to this slightly unnerving and creepy vibe that's hard to put your finger on. Put together in such a specifically novel way that I still don't think has ever been truly replicated. And obviously with loads of their absolute best tracks ever, the boom-bap hip-hop beats and anxious flute riffs of Julian Candy, the extended psychedelic IDM freakout of Alpha and Omega, the deceptively catchy pitch-modded sample mashups of 1969, the heavily off-kilter but oddly comforting You Could Feel the Sky, the moody and pensive The Beach at Red Point, just to name a couple. There's no skips or filler on this thing. Unless you count Magic Window, which I don't really, because that's just dead silence. The brief interludes in between every single major track are often some of the most iconic and easily recognizable moments to come from the duo, such as The Smallest Weird Number, among others. Some of my own favorites include the melancholic minimal chord progressions of Over the Horizon Radar, the MIDI pianos and bassy atmospheric effects of Diving Station, and the hissing ambience and echoing flutes of Opening the Mouth, which makes for the perfect creepy outro to The Beach at Red Point. This album's also spawned lots of Easter egg hunts out of the fan base who call attention to super minor details, like the fact that the album is 66 minutes and 6 seconds long, as an allusion to the sign of the devil. And what do you know, there's also a track here called The Devil is in the Details. Obviously, I completely agree with the reputation this album's gotten, and I have pretty much nothing bad to say about it. but it's still never quite crossed that 9 out of 10 threshold for me on a personal level, and I've never fully been able to articulate why. I think back when I reviewed it way back when, I chalked it up to being a slight downer of a listen, but considering which album I have ranked immediately above this one, I really don't think that's it. A, depressing music can still be amazing, and B, this really isn't even that depressing a listen to begin with. None of this stuff, puts me in a bad mood or anything. Maybe there's a slight emotional distance here. I suppose it's the kind of thing that on average I tend to have more, respect and fascination for how unique the sound design is and the kind of thing that evokes strong feelings out of me all the time. My reactions tend to lean more on the, ooh, that was interesting side, instead of, wow, that really got to me. But even then, there are moments that really get to me too, that can evoke some sense of fear and desperation through their melodies, but also occasional calmness and comfort depending on the moment. Even a tiny little bit of joy too, if I guess Dawn Chorus kinda has it. This stuff gets me in the feels more than, say, your average Outerger album. So it's not like this is a major thing either. Perhaps part of the distance comes from how fragmented the structuring is. I don't feel like this album is really trying to set up some kind of greater narrative arc or musical environment to immerse you in, so much as it's trying to be this strange musical puzzle or enigma that challenges you to figure out its secrets. Throw all these seemingly unrelated ideas and concepts and have you do some of the work to figure out what the through line might be. But it's not like they're making you do all the work to piece it together either. There's still a coherent vibe and mood to this project that makes everything feel like it all makes sense together. It's just more abstract about it, and I'm obviously not about to criticize art for being too abstract. Also, obviously, there's another album I have ranked above this one that a lot of people would argue is even less cohesive than this. Maybe it's the fact that the album takes a while to really get going for me. Most of my biggest favorite stuff doesn't come in until a little ways into the album. But A, you could say the same thing about my actual favorite Boards of Canada album, which does actually cross the 9 out of 10 boundary, and B, that obviously isn't meant to be shade on the earlier moments for the album, like Music is Math or Sunshine Recorder. Maybe it's just a combination of all these things, I don't know, but at the end of the day, it's still an all-timer. We are still talking about one of the most well-acclaimed electronic albums ever made. Who cares about this nitpicky kind of stuff? Yes, out of these top 5 all-timers in this ranking, it's the one I personally put on the least, but it's still amazing and I love it. There's just 4 more albums from these artists I happen to personally love more, such as... Whoopsh. At number 4, I have Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. And now we arrive at the albums I've already scored in the 9 range, most of which could switch any other places with each other depending on my mood. This is the lowest of the 9, since it's probably the most difficult to recommend to a lay listener. 2.5-hour record almost entirely made out of minimal ambient drone pieces is not exactly the kind of thing which will be everyone's cup of tea. But at the same time, I feel like most of this album's biggest critics just tend not to be fans of ambient music in general and haven't been able to find their entry point into this genre yet. Which, even if I've heard lots of far less accessible records in this genre, God help any of those people if they try to put on some early 70s Klaus Schultz or Stars of the Lid in their refinement of the decline or something. I at least get their standpoint, especially considering this is yet another point of Aphex Twin's insane popularity, leading to this reaching audiences who wouldn't ordinarily be giving anything close to this genre a shot in the first place otherwise. I can easily see how this wouldn't exactly be changing the preconceptions of people who already struggled with ambient music in the past. Now, as someone who's been fully immersed in this... Oh, god damn it, I forgot to change my shirt. Now, as someone who's been fully immersed in this particular niche for about half of his entire lifetime, I have to pretty much echo the hype everyone's thrown at this over the years and continue to hold it up as one of the biggest gold standards for ambient drone records of this particular stripe. Or gray stripe, if you will. Yes, I know not everyone who's really into ambient music messes with this either, but I'm personally not going to be giving this stuff anything but the highest praises it usually gets. Even back when I first heard it early on in my own journey getting into ambient music, I seem to recall I could tell there was something special there, even if I wasn't sure if I loved it right away. Sure, it's 2.5 hours of mostly minimal ambient drones that don't have much progression over each of their lengthy runtimes, but goddamn if those 2.5 hours aren't packed with so much fascinating variety. Be it more accessible melodic moments like Cliff's, Rhubarb, or Lichen, whose iconic comforting shifting pad progressions and delicate synth tones have already captured the hearts of millions, to minimal, unchanging mechanical percussion loops like Blur, Weathered Stone, or Shiny Metal Rods, which can low-key turn out to be pretty solid bangers without feeling out of place, to foreboding dark ambient drones like Tree and Hanky and Grass that really lean into being spooky and unnerving, but still have plenty of texture and can become moving in how strikingly despondent they are. Tree in particular held up a lot more to me on most recent listens than I remembered. And seemingly every kind of mix in between, like immersively windy sound effects of Spots and Gray Stripe, or electric power surge sounds and tassels, the chilling melodic subspace of Blue Calyx, which best recaptures the vibe of the album he put out before this one, the dreamlike floatiness of Curtains, the reverb-covered wind chimes of White Blur 1, the out-of-nowhere bright flashes of twinkling, almost tropical flavor melody in Z-Twig, the hypnotic tribal percussion and flute riffs of Windowsill, the straightforward beat-driven mood brightener of Hexagon, the dramatic alien pads of Matchsticks making for a deceptively strong and satisfying finish, the melancholy cosmic loneliness of the sort of centerpiece Stone and Focus, which at this point has pretty much cemented itself over Rhubarb as my favorite track here. Maybe you'll get a track like Domino or White Blur 2, which can get the slightest bit irritating in their somewhat harsher and emptier melodic loops, but there's so few misses over the entire record. Even the 2 bonus tracks added onto that recent expanded edition are really cool too. You get 11 minutes of cool spacey meandering pads in TH1 Even Slower, and a reversed orchestral cover of Rhubarb, which I think speaks for itself. Each one of these 25 or 27 tracks perfectly set up their sonic environment and have the sense of place that you can really lose yourself in, as the best ambient music should. None of them harsh each other's vibe, and if anything, putting them all together just makes the whole experience feel even more impressively expansive and deep. And at no point have I ever found the length to be too much. I don't need to hear another record in the Cyro style again as long as I live, but I would happily eat up another 3 or more albums of lucid dreaming inspired material from him like this. Back when I first reviewed the album, I seem to recall saying something along the lines of this possibly being objectively his best work for its sheer quantity of quality, which that is not what objectively means, you dumbass. God, I can't listen to my writing from 2016. But I imagine people still, got the point I was trying to get across, and my rationale for saying that, from how it can still almost leave me wanting more in spite of how damn much I got. Fair enough if you find this album too simplistic, repetitive, uninteresting, and or overstuffed. And even more fair if you think it's just way overhyped. All Aphex Twin's music is kind of overhyped to some extent, and the people who act like he's the only person who ever made great ambient music could stand to get out and try more stuff. But this album in particular, I believe, is actually deserving of its hype, and I personally can't get enough of this shit. And there's still 3 more albums to talk about here that mean just as much to me, if not even more, so let's get into those, shall we? Whoopsh. And number 3, I have Music Has the Right to Children. Alright, next up we got my favorite Boards of Canada album, which I'm sure everyone would have seen coming a mile away. Yeah, I know GeoGeddy's more the cool pick to have at the top. Music Has the Right has more of a reputation of being the more pleasant and accessible precursor to what that album would progress into darker and more experimental territory. Though, how big is that difference, really? The instrumental ingredients going into this one are all pretty much exactly the same. Dusty instrumental hip-hop beats with a bit of a twist, their trademark retro synth fragments, usually concrete influences, and puzzling sample mashups. This stuff really isn't that much less weird or out there than the stuff you'd hear on GeoGeddy. The mood is just marginally more major key and chill on average. There's loads of cool, iconic, and creative stuff that only get more and more fascinating to explore and re-explore the more years I spend with it. The shuffling beats and humming pads of An Eagle in Your Mind, the stop-start banging and DJ's scratching of 6010, the bubbling wormhole of synth riffs, drones, and beats in Rue the Whirl, the melancholy percussiveness of Pete Standing Alone, the bizarre mix of spoken sample fragments and sound effects going through lush synth washes of Aquarius, or the icy electric pianos and hip-hop beats of Turquoise Hexagon Sun, which is like the first track I think of when I think of Boards of Canada in passing. And that's obviously not to get into all the iconic interludes that almost feel like zooming out and looking over this beautiful place out in the country through outdated security cameras and control rooms full of obsolete tech. This album very much shows this duo having publicly arrived onto the scene fully formed, with every bit of their unique, easily recognizable sound already perfectly nailed down. Gio Gaddy, I suppose, has a greater quantity and variety of ideas and combines them in stranger and more unexpected ways, so it's going a bit deeper in that sense. And that album was obviously going for a noticeably darker tone, but this album's more pleasant vibe, if you even really want to call it that, ends up with a similar effect that I would argue does a better job of disarming you. The creepy factor is still very much there, but it's never overt. Not trying to tantalize you with all this hidden cult or devil imagery or loose Cold War aesthetics or musical puzzles difficult to make heads or tails of, but instead sort of presenting these mixes that feel a little halfway between happy and nostalgic, and sad, lonely, and mysterious. Just hitting on that specific spot that makes you keep wondering if that subtle feeling of offness and wrongness is even really there, or if it's all just in your head. The entire thing has a more grounded and relatable emotional center and more of an overarching sense of place and environment. It's like imagining yourself as a child going on a field trip, nature hike, only to end up getting lost from the group and feeling some anxious thoughts in the back of your mind about whether you're going to die of starvation or have to survive in the wilderness, but you've only been missing for like 10 minutes, so well, why don't you keep exploring just in case you find the people you're looking for? Maybe something else cool, like that factory-looking building poking out from the forest over there. Oh, and that pond next to it looks cool, too. And where's that smoke in the distance coming from? And before you know it, that 10 minutes becomes like an hour, and some teachers have gotten very worried and are calling up search parties and stuff. The idea of the devil might be scary when you're a kid, but when you're an adult, there's no scare in the world like a kid going missing. That could happen to literally anyone, as if it were nothing in the moment. Although I do think this album's unspoken narrative does have a happy ending, and the kid would get reunited with his class by the time the relieving resolution of Open the Light and the expansively satisfying credits roll of Happy Cycling show up. By the way, how the fuck did I ever survive with the version of this album that didn't have Happy Cycling on it? That is easily among the top 5 best tracks from them ever for me at this point. But whatever. None of this narrative element is actually directly in there in the text of the record. The track titles vaguely help set up the idea and put that environment in my head, combining nature and technology, but it's mainly just a description of the feelings I get while listening to it. And those feelings are more affecting than anything else this duo ever put out before or after. Yes, my usual nostalgia bias plays a lot into that. I mean, my favorite track from the duo is still Roy G. Biv, that one oasis of warmer optimism and hope which has never gotten old to me, and is still their most iconic tune by far. But that seems only fitting since this is also an album designed to feed off nostalgia. Putting a then novel twist on nostalgic imagery and sonic ideas was a massive part, if not just the biggest part, of what captured so many people's imaginations and got this duo such a devoted cult following in the first place. In my opinion, Music Has the Right to Children is the most complete and all-encompassing look at the specific kind of appeal that got me to become a fan of Boards of Canada in the first place. It's the album of theirs I fell in love with the earliest, stuck with me the longest, and resonated with me the deepest. And yeah. Whoopsh. And number 2, I have Drux. And speaking of impressive musical world building, albeit probably not quite as intentional here, but still pretty much knocked out of the park anyway and on an even greater scale. I know this is becoming less and less of a hot take to say with each passing year, but for all the people that have talked about this album's complete scattershot mixed bag approach, low-key sort of including RDJ himself, who said he designed it to be the kind of thing you would just pick some favorite tracks from and leave the rest. Drux is an album that always hits best for me when I sit through all 100 minutes of it from front to back in its original 30-track sequencing. And I do not believe the experience is incohesive or scattershot at all. I mean, I'm not going to say that all 30 tracks carry equal weight or importance when massive 8-minute drum and bass epics are sharing time with 20-second or less sound effect fragments like Bit 4 and Ausuis. But I do believe all of these pieces are adding up to a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. On my most recent revisits to this album in preparation for this video, I felt like I was watching two loose narrative arcs play out in parallel. One was the 9 big drum and bass tracks, which the more times I've re-listened to, the more they hit for me. Even if my favorites may remain the tracks that were already longtime favorites to begin with, like the ever-iconic Vord Haspin, and especially the two 8-minute cuts, Mount St. Michael plus St. Michael's Mount and Zygomatic 17, that made the best uses of their lengths through all their complex progressions, while other tracks like 54 Semru beats still hit for me on a less deep level, and I tend to less feel the urge to put on out of context. I did start to really pick up on a subtle underlying sense of progression between all of them together. First, I noticed how the melodies of Omegia Switch 7 felt very similar to the melodies of Vord Haspin. Both may be buried in aggressive seas of percussion and hard to fully make out, but the former did feel like a direct continuation of the latter. And then I noticed how that was kind of the case for all the drum and bass tracks. They all sort of feel like continuations on each other's ideas and like they themselves were fitting together in an unspoken musical story of some kind, with Zygomatic 17 acting as the climactic finish to that arc. Also, as a side note, on most recent re-listens, I did warm up to the track Meltface 6 a decent bit. That cut never used to stand out to me that much in years previous, but I came to quite like the contrast between the banging beats and aggressive acid synths and the more melancholic and introverted melodies being placed on top. That one bit where it just dies down into pure ambience and briefly starts to sound a little like Curtains from Saw 2 stuck out to me in particular. I wouldn't go as far as to say that it's like a new favorite or anything, but I like that track more than I used to. Anyway, there's that side of the album kind of forming its backbone, but all the bits in between form their own loose arc as well, fitting together in a more introspective side to this album that just feels like stewing in various negative feelings and depression and anxiety. Obviously, the piano stuff has always been among my favorite stuff on the album. The obvious warm and comforting Avril 14th, everyone knows. The unnerving Strotha Teinhe, the desperate Kessin Dalef, and severely anxious Father. My favorite track on the album, Petietel Cx Hitdui, which just feels like having a nice moment to yourself to cry in a dark hallway where no one can see you. And the prepared piano stuff hitting similar notes through some old school mechanical clockwork type energy, either on the more comforting side like Jin Weithek, Hyaskulias Lifadaigro, or Ruglen Holan, or on the more dark and percussive side like Prep Gorlek 2 and Beshku 3 Epnum. Yeah, I'm still making semi-honest attempts to pronounce these titles out loud despite RDJ having designed them specifically to be a pain in the ass to do so. Whatever. But all the other random stuff feeds into this arc too, tracks that also just stew in those negative feelings in their own ways. Be it the subtle sadness of the down-tempo loops of Bibitian chord, the flighty harmonium chords of QK Thur, and the church-like atmosphere of Batum Romata, and of course the handful of darkest moments on the album that go out of their way to feel like horror movie soundtracks, like Gweli Murnans and Guarek 2, contrasting heavily with RDJ seemingly reminding himself that he does have love in his life through the inclusion of his parents' voicemails singing him happy birthday on Lorna Derrick. And as many dark and foreboding ideas as this album scrolls through, it does keep trying to find that light at the end of the tunnel. Jin Weithek and Nanu 2 make for the perfect reflective bookends for this entire album, and the latter feels like a nice sigh of comforting relief at the very end to tie this arc together. Yes, all of this stuff coming together on the same album looks and sounds like a random heap of ideas, but all of it feels very personal and like they're all contributing to the same overarching vibe in their own odd ways. And I don't think either the drum and bass side or the experimental and modern classical sides to this album work as well when taken on their own as they do when they're literally being cut in between each other like every other track. I'll say the same thing about the feelings Drux gives me as a complete whole that I did back when I reviewed the album. Listening to it reminds me of the time my grandfather passed away and my extended family pitched together to clean out his house. I think I was even listening to this album while that was happening, and it fit the situation perfectly in more ways than one. Drum and bass tracks soundtracking the menial labor soundtracking the menial labor parts, moving furniture and stuff. Other time was spent digging up memories from a time gone by and various trinkets from decades past. There was just that overarching mood of loss. Also, the house itself was very old and creaky and had lots of different rooms to just barely be able to house my mom's immediate family of 9 in the 70s, which fit the expansiveness of the track listing. That specific experience always stuck with me and tied itself directly to the experience I always have with this album. RDJ may have thrown it together seemingly at complete random, but the way all of these completely unrelated ideas end up coalescing and painting this odd abstract picture that's still surprisingly easy to emotionally relate to make it feel all the more inventive. And it doesn't feel too overstuffed for its own good either. Those 100 minutes always seem to zip by. Even if it may have been stumbled upon by accident, Drux is Aphex Twin's densest and most impressive holistic masterpiece for me, and it's come to mean something truly special and personal, as well as a highly unique experience that I can't get out of any other album. But as special and personal as this album feels to me, I still don't hold it as close to me as the album I have ranked at the very top, which is exactly the pick you probably already figured it would be before you even clicked on this video, but let's talk about it. Whoopsh. At number 1, I have selected Ambient Works 8592. So, honest question. Has putting this at number 1 become a controversial take? That might sound like a dumb question to ask about quite possibly the most universally well-acclaimed electronic album ever, an album that used to be like the most obvious number 1 pick for this ranking you could possibly go with, and at one point was probably the least controversial pick one could even make when naming your own all-time favorite in this entire genre. But now every Aphex Twin ranking I've seen over the past couple of years has this near the bottom or middle tier at best. I feel like there's more and more people saying this is one of his worst albums, or even just his worst. I feel like there's been a proper Dark Side of the Moon style turnaround and backlash from people on this one. I expressed the weird mood shift around this album in a comment I left on Fantano's Aphex tier list video, and I got someone reacting to me along the lines of, yeah, everyone only said they liked this album because it was cool to say that, then they actually listened to the album and discovered it was shit. Which was absolutely freaking buckweld to see someone saying, like, really? Everyone was only pretending to like this? No one had legit reasons for loving it? God damn, what an implication. Okay, obviously I'm not going to stand up here and say there aren't plenty of legit reasons to not mess with 8592. It may be hailed as pretty much the progenitor of the entire ambient techno and IDM scene, but the playbook this album set down has been directly copied hundreds and hundreds of times over so many years that it may not even seem that special anymore when you look back on it. One could even argue that the historical importance so often assigned to it is inflated somewhat. I seem to vaguely recall Mike Paradinas making an offhand comment somewhere that the 85 in the title might just be an exaggeration, and that most of this stuff wasn't nearly that old. Citation needed on where exactly he said that, though. Don't take my word for that. And dates credited in the title aside, he definitely was not the first person to professionally release an album in this specific ambient techno style either. At the very least, Biosphere beat him to the punch when he put out Microgravity in 1991. So, yeah, if you hear this in 2025 and just find it to be absolutely nothing special or even boring, I would get it. And one album getting the level of hype 8592 did of this kind of once-in-a-generation individual genius really isn't that helpful in the long run. It wasn't helpful to Dark Side of the Moon either, or Sgt. Pepper, or any other album that gets added to the canon of literal greatest work of art mankind's ever created. Even if this was very much the album that inspired all the loads of ambient techno copycats in all the decades since, not Microgravity, and its level of influence is now comparable to Dark Side of the Moon. Once an entire generation of people tries to tell the next generation that this is literally the greatest thing ever made, they're just asking for this kind of backlash. Widespread generational influence is great, but it's not everything and doesn't mean the album will always hold up. But I still have to put this at number 1, not because I expect to get any cool points for it or anything. I think people should know by now that I have never given a fuck about cool points. 8592 takes the top spot of this ranking purely because it is the album here which is best equipped to take me personally to my happy place. I've heard so many of these loads of copycats. I've obviously heard the entire Warp Artificial Intelligence series that came in the wake of this album's success. I've heard people make ambient techno in this style so many times, all the way up through present day, and still nobody can make this specific sound hit for me on the level of 8592. Closest I've ever heard to something that's able to match it is Outakers Incunabula, and even that one is still not quite on 8592's level. This album just puts me in that headspace of thinking back to the days when I was a kid and spent my earliest times discovering the internet. Discovering tracks from this album through there being the unlicensed soundtracks to old Flash games. So listening to this album transports me into some, like, liminal blank white void where you play puzzle games made out of geometric shapes. And all the melodies are just that damn good. The comforting synths and vocal samples of Ixtal, the minimal bass lines and pads and light tapping of Tha and Actium, the spacey chords of Pulsewith, the ever-iconic blinky lead sequences of Aegispolis, the warm and dramatic pads and banging breaks of Helios Fan, the mysterious, quirky, and enveloping space alien vibes of We Are the Music Makers and Schottky Seventh Path, the low-key, kind of funky ambient techno bangers of Ptolemy, and its more industrial-flavored acid techno companion Green Calx. Even if tracks like the latter of those, or maybe another like Headfeldium, might add up to a slightly different, harsher vibe that doesn't always complement the mood I'm looking to get when I put this on, I still can't help but get wrapped up in its minimal low-key universe anytime I put this thing on and get blasted by pure nostalgia all the way through every time. Fair enough if you aren't moved by the material on display here or think it's massively overrated. You wouldn't be wrong. But 8592 is simply a part of my DNA at this point, and among those albums that made me the kind of person I am today with a passion to put in all the work into making a video like this while I'm sick, after already having continually putting in the work to make these kinds of videos for 10 straight years now. Even if it's not the literal greatest thing ever made, I still view it to be the very best in its particular niche, and the most fitting possible choice I could go with for the #1 spot of this ranking. So that is finally going to be it. Jesus Christ, this week of videos was so much damn work. I don't know if this is going to be an experiment I'll ever end up repeating. I can kind of see why Arcada from Glass Reflections stopped trying to pull this 5 videos in a week trick years ago. I felt like it was still worth it for this one-off special occasion. And 10 years into making music reviews on YouTube. Again, I'm still not sick of doing these videos. I'd be more than happy to keep it up for another decade or longer at this point. Thank you once again for all the support you've given me over all these years. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.